we see the movie 300, speaking of the Persian Empire, right, and Persian warriors. We look at 300, and a lot of people almost take it like subconsciously do take it as gospel, like, oh, that's the way it was. Like, Persians were the bad guys, and the Greeks were the good guys. And in this story, it was like, and I kind of like what they did in 300, kind of make it like the Greeks were still kind of the bad guys, but the Spartans were the good guys. They were just these guys in the middle that just wanted a bunch of libertarians back in the day that used to fight and wanted freedom. But it's an interesting twist. But it made me think more about that because I do know a lot about Persian history to write something like this. So speaking of that, speaking of history, we know about Thermopylae, the Battle of Thermopylae and everything. You shared a podcast with me not too long ago about Thermopylae, going a little depth. You want to go ahead and explain a little bit of what that podcast you sent me was about and how it kind of pertains to the story and where we want to take the story?
So the podcast itself was sent to me by my co-host of my podcast, Room 303, where we just talk about all sports and video games and movies and stuff. And so he stumbled upon this podcast called Hardcore History. Let me see if I can get the actual dude's name who does the podcast. But this dude just goes into depth in a staggering amount of detail, right? So it's a 3-part series that explains the Persian Empire, right, from beginning to end, from inception to peak rise and dominance over the continent. And there it is, my boy's in the chat right now. It's Dan Harlan. Yeah, and so he goes into this detail, and it's 3 parts. It's like 12 hours long. And he explains all the players that were in that epicenter, essentially the cradle of modern-day civilization. And he starts breaking down how each person played into it and how those people themselves carried themselves, whether it was how they perceived their gods or how they perceived the gods of their enemies. And he goes in and breaks all that down. And so he breaks down the Greeks and the Spartans and the Persian Empire and how it was ruled by Cambyses and then how it stumbled and the battle between the brothers and then how it ended up falling. So it goes into a whole bunch of that. 12 hours is really in detail. Like I always tell my friend that you have to like sit there and actually like pay attention. You can't just like, you can't be messing around on your phone. If you
that guy really did his history too when it comes to Persian history, because ancient Persian history is really hard to study if you're like into it, because there's just so many different takes on it. You know what I mean? From the people that were conquered by it. I mean, you have like the Israelites. You know, the Bible takes records of the Persian Empire, the Sumerians, you have the Median Empire, which was originally the empire that that Cyrus came from. You have the Egyptians' history on it, and then you have Herodotus, which is what most of us in Western civilizations consider as like the Bible when it comes to the history of Iran and the Persian Empire, which is crazy to me because it comes to the history and the accounts of the Persian Empire come from the Greek Herodotus, who's the historian. They call him the father of history. It actually comes from the Histories, which is like this collection of books he has where he would just pretty much write down different stories and histories that he heard. He tried to, He tried to confirm some of them, and some of them he just said history according to, and then would take it and add it to his collection. But it's interesting because it's like 3rd century BC is like the earliest recording of that in the Library of Alexandria, and even then they said that wasn't like really the original collection of Herodotus. So who knows like what changes were made. You know what I mean? It's interesting that Darius himself has his own account of the whole history. It's crazy when you think of that because we do kind of take it as gold.
Yeah, and it's very interesting when all this is presented because you have the aspect of whenever another kingdom successfully conquers, the first thing they do is tear down the existing. They pillage, they rifle, they set everything ablaze, and they target places of worship, right? They go after your gods, and then they go after libraries. If you had any form of written word, it was something that they targeted and burnt down. It's still something that happened in more modern history, right? When in Americas and the revolutions and all these other things, like libraries are targeted all the time, and they're burnt down because they don't want that knowledge to carry on. Without that knowledge to carry on, then people lose themselves, right? So they no longer have that connection to their ancestors. And then from that aspect, it's easy for those civilizations to assimilate the conquered people into their own indoctrination, right? Because that's what every nation, country tries to do. They try to indoctrinate. That's what you see happening worldwide. Everyone has their religious beliefs, their viewpoints, the way they perceive economics, the way they perceive philosophy, the way they perceive science, the boundaries of morality they're willing to push. All that stuff is constantly being fed into by these civilizations. And that's where they get their indoctrination. That's where they get the philosophy. That's how they're able to breed a nation that goes on and perpetuates that information or that perception.
It's crazy too because it goes with the whole saying, the victors write history, right? They're the ones that decide what history is going to be. But it's very interesting because the Persian Empire was so huge, was so vast. It had so many people that actually liked being under the rule of the Persian Empire that certain documents, scrolls, and certain parts of their history were hidden purposefully. So that way, when a new empire came through or somebody came to pillage, it would be able to be uncovered sometime in the future to preserve that history. That's why I feel, I don't know if you definitely watch, you're a film guy, so you've definitely seen Indiana Jones, like all the archaeologists.
Yeah.
There was a point in time where I wanted to be an archaeologist because I thought it was like Indiana Jones with the whip and you get the cool hat. But what I really liked about the film though is that they would uncover a history and then they'd be like, yeah, but did you know that the Ark of the Covenant was really here and all this stuff? And you're just like, where do they get this information? I mean, it's crazy because archaeologists are always at the very front of history when it comes to recovering history. And it's like archaeologists know, and I think for the most part, archaeologists have preserved a lot of the Persian history because of that. When people ask me, what do I use for research when it comes to writing these things about ancient cultures? And a lot of it comes just from articles written by archaeologists that have made findings, and then from those findings have been able to deduct and create a timeline with what we already know, what to debunk or to confirm what we've received as gospel.
Right. And archaeologists are kind of on the forefront of why I always say time isn't linear, because civilizations are born, they're bred, and then boom, they extinguish, just like dinosaurs were put out, just like the Persian Empire was put out, just like the great Greeks and the Spartans and the first democracies, and then you have Mongolians going and killing, I think it's like 10% of the world's population with Genghis Khan, and how they were just dominating the Eastern Asias all the way into the Eastern Europe's. Like, so when they go through and they do raise the villages and burn those people and all that stuff, they essentially extinguish that timeline. And that's why I always say time isn't linear. You can always look at like the Egyptian pyramids, right? Today, in all our technological advancements, whether it's internet, us talking around the world, making 3,000 miles seem like nothing, we're face to face right now, and then we have a bunch of listeners with us, we still don't know how they built the pyramids, right? And that, if that doesn't blow your mind and show you that time itself isn't linear, then I don't know.
It's aliens.
You think it's aliens?
Me and Nick said we think it's aliens.
I actually think that through their study of like plants and animal life, they were able to create some sort of process of anti-gravity, and using anti-gravity as their main piece of science, they were able to build these pyramids. And one of the things that isn't really said anymore is these pyramids used to be covered in like precious gems.
Not just rocks that we see out there.
Yeah, it's not just the way it was smooth. They were so smooth and so clean and so beautiful and pristine, right? So there was almost no ridges, but through the loss of their civilization, loss of war, like I said, with the burning of libraries, and they didn't even have a lot of written word. They had more of the pictures, the hieroglyphics, and things of that nature, right? So through the loss of that preservation of education and knowledge, we lost that process. But if it was smooth and there was even less to grab onto, and then the intricacies with the traps and the doors and getting to room, you can really see that they had a very profound grasp on technology, and
Yeah.
somewhere along the line it got lost.